It all started on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday in May. The sun was beating down on Pleasant Pines subdivision with an intensity that made suburban lawns demand attention. I had just finished mowing mine to the exact 3-inch height specified in the HOA handbook. Yes, they actually measure it. When I decided it was finally time to replace my weathered American flag. The old stars and stripes had served proudly for nearly 5 years, but after countless storms and scorching summer days, it was starting to fade and fray at the edges. As a veteran who had served 2 tours overseas, I believed in treating Old Glory with respect. I carefully took down the old flag, methodically folded it into the proper triangle as I had done hundreds of times during my service, and placed my new, vibrant flag in its place. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing that flag catch the breeze for the first time. It always made me stand a little straighter. Little did I know, this simple act of patriotism would trigger the wrath of Karen Wilkerson, president of the Pleasant Pines Homeowners Association and self-appointed guardian of suburban perfection. Excuse me, what do you think you're doing? Karen's voice rang out. I turned to see her marching across my freshly cut lawn, her highlighted blonde bob swinging with righteous indignation, clipboard clutched to her chest like a medieval shield. Her signature white capri pants and nautical striped top served as her uniform of authority, completed by oversized designer sunglasses that hit her eyes but not her disapproval. Good afternoon, Karen, I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral despite the familiar sense of dread her approach always triggered. Just putting up a new flag. The old one was getting worn. Karen's eyes narrowed behind her sunglasses as she scanned my home's exterior, hunting for violations like a bird of prey searching for a field mouse. Her gaze flicked from my newly installed flag to the potted plants on my porch to the trim around my windows, cataloging potential infractions for future reference. Well, you didn't submit a flag replacement form, she said. That's a violation. And that new flag is at least 20% larger than the previous one, which exceeds the maximum allowable size differential for exterior decorative elements as outlined in Section 4.4, Paragraph 7 of the Community Guidelines. I took a deep breath and silently counted to 5, a technique I had learned during stressful situations in the military. Karen, it's the exact same size flag, and there's no flag replacement form in the handbook. She adjusted her designer sunglasses, pushing them higher on her nose with one manicured finger. There most certainly is. I would know, I wrote it myself last month. You'll be receiving a formal citation and fine by email this evening, and you need to take that down immediately until the proper paperwork is filed and approved by the Architectural Review Committee. I stood my ground, flagpole in hand. I'm not taking down the American flag, Karen. There's no provision in our bylaws preventing residents from flying it. In fact, the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005 specifically prohibits HOAs from restricting homeowners from displaying the U.S. flag. Her face flushed a shade of red nearly matching the stripes on my new flag. I could almost see the steam building behind those expensive sunglasses. Don't you dare quote laws to me, she snapped. I've been president of this association for 7 years. The Architectural Review Committee meeting is tomorrow at 4 p.m. sharp. I suggest you prepare for significant penalties. With that, she pivoted on her designer sandals and stalked away, already furiously typing on her phone, no doubt rallying her HOA minions for the next day's ambush. I watched as she marched down the sidewalk, stopping briefly to take a photo of the Rodriguez family's trash can that was visible from the street, a clear violation of Article 12 of the Community Guidelines. Karen and I had history. When I moved into Pleasant Pines 3 years ago after my military service, I had inadvertently become her pet project. First, it was my mailbox being 2 inches taller than regulation. Then it was the unapproved shade of white I had used to touch up my fence. Each time I complied, figuring it wasn't worth the battle. But this time was different. This was about the flag I had served under, and I wasn't backing down. That evening, I received the promised email citation, complete with a digitally inserted ruler showing the alleged size discrepancy between my old and new flags. Karen had also attached a newly created flag replacement application form, a 4-page document requiring everything from the flag's dimensions to the manufacturer's information, and a signed affidavit confirming that the flag was made in America. At the bottom was a note indicating that the Architectural Review Committee would consider my application in no less than 30 days, and until then, no flag was to be displayed. I printed the email, highlighted the most ridiculous portions, and pinned it to my refrigerator as a reminder of the absurdity I was dealing with. Then I did some research on homeowners' rights regarding flag displays and went to bed, my new flag still flying proudly outside. The next morning, I left for work earlier than usual to avoid any potential confrontation. As a structural engineer for a major construction firm, I had deadlines to meet and couldn't afford to waste time on neighborhood politics. It wasn't until I returned home that evening that I discovered something was terribly wrong. My flagpole stood empty. The new American flag was gone. I immediately suspected Karen but didn't want to make accusations without proof. I checked my doorbell camera footage, and what I saw made my blood boil. There was Karen at 2:15 in the afternoon, removing my flag from its pole. The footage continued as she walked off my property with it, disappearing from the camera's view. I was furious but decided to handle this properly. I called the non-emergency police line to report the theft. Pleasant Pines Police Department, how can I direct your call? The dispatcher answered. Hello, I'd like to report a theft. My American flag was stolen from my property today, and I have video evidence of who took it. 20 minutes later, Officer Martinez was at my door, reviewing the footage. He was a young officer, probably in his early 30s, with a serious demeanor that softened slightly when he learned about my military background. He took detailed notes and asked several questions about my history with Karen and the HOA. So this isn't the first time you've had issues with Mrs. Wilkerson? He asked, raising an eyebrow. Not even close, I replied, showing him my collection of citations for infractions ranging from holiday lights with excessive lumens to unapproved bird feeder placement. But she's never actually taken my property before. Officer Martinez nodded thoughtfully. I'll pay Mrs. Wilkerson a visit and see what she has to say. We'll try to recover your property. I thanked him and he left with a copy of the video. Part of me felt a twinge of guilt for involving the police, but Karen had crossed a line. Property theft wasn't a neighborhood squabble. It was a crime. I went to bed that night wondering if I had escalated things too far, but I reminded myself that I wasn't the one who had stolen someone else's property. The next morning I was working from home when my doorbell rang. It was Officer Martinez, looking uncomfortable, his formal demeanor slightly cracked. Mr. Johnson, we spoke with Mrs. Wilkerson last night. He began, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. She admitted to taking your flag but claims it was within her rights as HOA president because it violated. Here's your revised transcript in a smooth flowing paragraph format. Officer Martinez explained that Mrs. Wilkerson had confiscated the flag until the proper paperwork was completed. When I asked if she had returned it, I could already tell from his expression that the answer wasn't going to be good. He grimaced and said, That's why I'm here, sir. Mrs. Wilkerson. Well, she burned it. For a moment I couldn't speak. The idea that someone would deliberately destroy an American flag out of spite left me speechless. I had seen men and women risk their lives for what that flag represented. She what? I finally managed to say. Martinez continued, explaining that she claimed it was an approved method of flag disposal, but that wasn't how it worked. Proper flag retirement ceremonies were conducted by specific organizations following strict protocols, and only for flags too worn or damaged to be displayed. More importantly, it wasn't her property to dispose of in any manner. I took a deep breath, a cold anger settling in my chest. I want to press charges. Martinez nodded. That's your right. And sir, you should know that flag desecration with malicious intent is actually a separate offense in our state. We've already explained this to Mrs. Wilkerson, though she insists she was simply following proper flag disposal procedures. Did she say where this happened? I asked. At the community fire pit in the park, he replied. She said she did it last night after we left her house. Apparently, she was concerned we might misunderstand the situation, and wanted to eliminate any issues. He shook his head slightly, his professional demeanor unable to fully hide his disbelief at Karen's actions. As we wrapped up our conversation and Officer Martinez prepared to leave, a commotion erupted outside. Stepping onto my porch, I saw Karen standing on the sidewalk, hands on her hips, watching as several officers placed evidence markers around the fire pit at the edge of the park. This is ridiculous. I was simply enforcing the rules. That flag was unauthorized, she shouted to anyone who would listen. Her voice carried across the morning air as neighbors began to gather, watching the scene unfold with interest. Some still in bathrobes, coffee mugs in hand, others pausing their morning jogs to witness the drama. Karen spotted me and Officer Martinez on my porch and pointed an accusatory finger. This is all your fault. You've never respected the rules that keep our property values high. You and your military entitlement think you're above the guidelines the rest of us follow. Martinez stepped forward. Ma'am, please lower your voice. We're conducting an investigation. An investigation over a flag? Do you know who my husband is? He plays golf with the mayor every Sunday. He's on a first-name basis with half the city council. Her tone was indignant, but the officer remained professional. Ma'am, you've admitted to taking property that didn't belong to you and deliberately destroying it. Additionally, you violated state law regarding the desecration of the American flag. I'm going to have to ask you to come to the station to give a formal statement. Her expression cycled through emotions, indignation, disbelief, and then for the first time genuine concern. A statement? Am I being charged with something? Over a flag violation? Her voice lost some of its volume, uncertainty creeping in. Theft and destruction of property to start with, Martinez replied calmly. The district attorney will determine if additional charges related to the flag desecration statute apply. Karen's perfectly maintained composure finally cracked. Criminal charges? But I'm the HOA president. I was enforcing the rules. I was protecting our neighborhood standards. Martinez remained patient. The HOA doesn't have the authority to take and destroy private property, ma'am. Being on the board gives you the right to issue citations within the framework of your bylaws, not to enter people's property and remove items you personally disapprove of. Now please, we need you to come with us. By now, at least a dozen neighbors had gathered at a respectful distance, watching as their formidable HOA president faced consequences, perhaps for the first time. The Patels from across the street, who had fought a 6-month battle with Karen over their excessively aromatic cultural cooking, were present. The Johnsons, no relation, who had been fined for their son's basketball hoop being visible from the street, stood among them. Even Mr. Guzman, who had nearly lost his composure at last month's HOA meeting when Karen criticized his accent, was watching with barely concealed satisfaction. 2 officers escorted a now silent Karen toward the patrol car, the reality of her situation finally dawning on her. Her face had lost its color, and her rigid posture had collapsed. The neighbors watched in stunned silence as Karen Wilkerson, the woman who had issued citations for everything from excessively fragrant flowers to holiday decorations left up 3 days past the seasonal allowance, was read her Miranda rights on the sidewalk of the very community she had ruled with an iron clipboard. Karen Wilkerson, you are under arrest for theft and destruction of property. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. The handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, and for the first time since I'd known her, Karen was completely speechless. Her eyes were wide with shock as the realization settled in. HOA rules didn't override actual laws, and the consequences for her actions wouldn't be settled with a strongly worded email or a fine paid to the community fund. Wait, she finally whispered as the officers guided her toward the patrol car. I'm being arrested? For a neighborhood violation? This can't be happening. But it was. And as the patrol car door closed behind Karen Wilkerson, I noticed my neighbors exchanging glances, some nodding, others allowing small smiles to break through. Mr. Rodriguez, whose trash can had been photographed just yesterday by Karen, gave me a subtle thumbs up. Mrs. Chin, who had been fighting Karen for months over her unauthorized rose varieties, clapped quietly. The community Karen had terrorized for years with her clipboard and rulebook was watching her face real consequences. Not a committee vote. Not a strongly worded letter. Actual legal ramifications for crossing the line from annoying to criminal. And as the patrol car pulled away from the curb, I couldn't help but think that perhaps Pleasant Pines would soon live up to its name.